Okay, logic lesson 2, we are going to learn this time about soundness and about how to evaluate the basic premises of our arguments. Before we start with those goals, let's do a quick review of what we learned in the last lesson. So, evidence for a claim should be presented in the form of an argument. Arguments are composed of statements. Statements are sentences that can be true or false. They are declarative sentences. Some of the statements in the argument are premises. Premises are the statements offered in support of the conclusion. And the other statement in the argument then is, of course, the conclusion. Arguments are composed of statements and the inferences, the mental steps that a reasoner makes from premises to conclusion. We have two kinds of premises. Basic premises. Basic premises are statements asserted without evidence or reasoning. All arguments must begin with at least one basic premise. If an argument doesn't start somewhere, it will just go on justifying each premise with a previous premise, so you have to start with some basic premises, some premises that are asserted without further evidence or reasoning. The second kind of premise is an intermediate conclusion. Intermediate conclusions are also statements offered in support of the final conclusion, but intermediate conclusions are meant to follow from the previous premises. So intermediate conclusions are premises, but they are statements that are supposed to follow from previous premises and imply further conclusions. So they're sort of middle steps in the argument. Keep in mind that only complex arguments contain intermediate conclusions. Simple arguments move directly from basic premises to intermediate conclusions. But most of the arguments that you'll read in philosophy, and really most of the arguments that you'll encounter in your life, are probably going to be complex arguments, meaning they have more than one inference, they have intermediate conclusions. So let's move on to the new concept, soundness. Soundness is the logic word that we use to describe good arguments. So sound arguments are good arguments. Good arguments are sound arguments. Not all arguments are good arguments. Any ideas what you think would make an argument a bad argument? Think about it. Think about the structure of the argument that we've learned so far, that arguments are composed of premises and conclusions and inferences from premises to conclusions. What do you think would make an argument a bad argument? Arguments are bad arguments if they begin with false or questionable premises. So, bad arguments may begin with false or questionable basic premises, or the inferences from premises to conclusion may not be valid inferences. Two things that can make an argument a bad argument: you begin with false basic premises, or your inferences from premises to conclusion are not valid. When I say that the inferences are not valid, what that means is that the premises do not imply the conclusion. Or another way of saying the same thing, the conclusion does not actually follow from the premises. So if those are the features of bad arguments, what do you suppose are the features of sound arguments? Remember, sound arguments are good arguments. So sound arguments will have all true premises. The reasoning from the premises to the conclusion will be valid. An argument is sound, an argument is a good argument if the premises are all true, the basic premises are all true, and the reasoning, the logical steps, the inferences from premises to conclusion is valid. So, I want to talk here a little bit about this term valid. First of all, valid is a technical term in logic. It does not mean true. Valid is not the same thing as true. In your ordinary, everyday use, people use these words interchangeably. People say, that's a valid point, and what they mean is that's true. In logic, valid and truth are different. Valid is different from truth. Valid has to do with the logical connection between the premises and the conclusion. The logical connection between the two, not with the truth of the premises. Let me put it this way. Statements can be true or false. That's what a statement is. It is a sentence that can be true or false. But only reasoning, inferences, and arguments can be valid or invalid. So again, statements are true or false. Reasoning, inferences, and arguments are valid or invalid. Statements are never valid or invalid. So what does it mean for reasoning, inference, or argument to be valid? An argument is valid if the premises logically imply the conclusion. It is invalid if the premises do not logically imply the conclusion. Another way of saying the same thing, an argument is valid if the conclusion follows logically from the premises. It is invalid if the conclusion does not follow logically from the premises. But how do we know if the conclusion follows from the premises, if the premises really do imply the conclusion? Here's the test. Here's how we know if it follows. An argument is valid when, if all the premises were true, it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false. An argument is valid when, suppose that the premises were true, the conclusion would also have to be true. So notice on this definition of validity, it doesn't say that the premises do have to be true for the argument to be valid. It only says if the premises were true, then the conclusion would also be true. That's what it means to say the premises imply the conclusion. If the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. So an argument is invalid then when, if the premises were true, the conclusion could still end up being false. Again, we don't care if the premises are actually true or false when we're thinking about validity. We only want to think, let's suppose for the sake of argument that the premises are true. If the premises were true, would it be possible for the conclusion to be false? If the answer to that is yes, then it's an invalid argument. Can you think of an invalid argument? An argument where even if the premises were true, the conclusion could still be false. Can you think of one? I'm going to give you some examples. Example 1. Start with this basic premise. If humans have free will, then we have immaterial souls that are not subject to the laws of nature. Basic premise. Premise asserted without support. Basic premise 2. Humans do not have free will. Conclusion, we do not have immaterial souls. So this is an invalid argument. Can you see why it's an invalid argument? What makes it an invalid argument? So we don't know if the premises are true and false. We don't know if basic premise 1 is true or false. We don't know if basic premise 2 is true. But let's just assume, for the sake of determining validity, that they're true. So just for now, let's suppose that the premises are true. Even if both of these premises were true, it does not follow that we do not have immaterial souls. Even if it were true that having free will requires us to have an immaterial soul, premise 1, and even if it were true that we do not have free will, it doesn't follow that we don't have immaterial souls. Maybe we still have immaterial souls, but they just don't have free will. They're determined by God. So the conclusion does not follow from the premises, because even if we accept the premises as true, that conclusion could still turn out to be false. Okay, a second invalid argument, starting with this basic premise. If the universe were designed and created by an intelligent being, then it will follow orderly, regular laws that humans can discover. Basic premise 2. The universe does, in fact, follow orderly, regular laws that humans can discover. Therefore, the universe was designed and created by an intelligent being. Again, pause, take a moment, see if you can figure out why this argument is an invalid argument. What makes it invalid? So this argument is invalid because even if premise 1 and premise 2 are true, it could still turn out that it was not designed or created by an intelligent being. So even if it were true that an intelligent being would create a universe that followed orderly, regular laws, and even if it is true that the universe does follow orderly, regular laws that humans can discover, that doesn't mean that those laws were created by an intelligent being. Maybe those laws came into place by some other means than the design of an intelligent creator. So both the basic premises could be true, and yet the universe and its order and its regularity could have come into being in some way other than by the creation of an intelligent being. Since the premises could be true and the conclusion could be false, it's an invalid argument. Let's look at another one. Different religions and cultures have different beliefs about the afterlife. The methods and tools of science cannot tell us which of those beliefs are true and which are false. Therefore, there is no objective truth about what happens when we die, but instead, whatever someone believes is true about the afterlife is true for them. Okay, look at the argument. It's an invalid argument. The conclusion does not follow from the premises. Can you explain why? What makes this argument invalid? So we accept premise 1 and premise 2 as true. When we're thinking about validity, we just suppose the premises are true. But even if it is true that different cultures have different beliefs about the afterlife and that science can't tell us which of those beliefs are right, it does not follow that there isn't a right belief. Instead, it might be that nobody knows what the right belief is, or maybe one culture is right and one culture is wrong, but there is an objective truth. So this argument is invalid because even if the premises are true, they don't imply the conclusion. The conclusion could still turn out to be false. Let's look at another argument. One last example of an invalid argument. Different religions and cultures have different beliefs about what is moral. The methods and tools of science cannot tell us which of those beliefs are true or false. Therefore, there is no objective truth about what is or is not moral, but instead whatever somebody believes is true about morality is true for them. Okay, This argument is basically exactly the same as the last argument, except I put moral instead of belief about an afterlife here. Since they both have the same form, this argument and the preceding argument, and they're both, as the preceding argument was invalid, this argument is also invalid. Right, look again at the previous argument. Looks almost exactly like a current argument, previous argument about the afterlife, invalid. Therefore, this argument about morality is invalid. It doesn't follow from the fact that people have different moral beliefs and from the fact that science can't tell us which beliefs are true and false that there is no truth. Okay, so to review a little bit of what we've just gone over when it comes to the concept of soundness. First, we want to think about validity. We want to not confuse validity with truth. Statements are true and false. Only reasoning and inferences and arguments are valid and invalid. Validity and invalidity have to do with the logical connection between the premises and the conclusion. So most of logic, most of what we're going to learn in logic is going to be about validity, about how to figure out and prove that an argument is valid or invalid. So today, for the rest of this lesson, we are going to focus on the other aspect of sound arguments, that they have all true premises. So sound arguments, all true premises. Reasoning from premises to conclusion is valid. For now, though, for the rest of today, we're just going to focus on this feature of sound arguments, that it has all true premises. So the next question we have to ask is, how do I know if a statement is true? Or at least, how do I know if it's reasonable to accept the statement as true? The first thing to consider when trying to figure out if we should accept a statement as true is that there are different types of statements or different types of claims. Some statements are empirical statements and others are not empirical. Empirical claims are the kinds of claims that can be supported or refuted with observation, experience, experiments. Again, empirical claims are the kinds of claims that can be confirmed, supported, or refuted with observation, experience, and experiments. These are the types of claims that you are used to learning about in most of your courses. Non-empirical claims, just as the name suggests, are not the sorts of claims that can be supported with observation, experiment, or experience. Empirical claims. Scientific claims are a classic case of empirical claims, claims that can be evaluated, tested, confirmed, refuted using the tools and methods of science. Scientific observation, data collection, and experiment are empirical claims. Claims about history, claims about what happened in the past, who did what, are also empirical claims. These are claims that are going to be supported or refuted by observations of artifacts, written texts, things like that from previous time periods and cultures. So again, claims about what happened in the past, who did what, can be supported by observation of things from the past. Okay, testimonial. So this is a word that I'm using to describe claims or observations that can be supported from the testimony of a suitably situated witness. So, for example, claims in a news report by a journalist that something happened. The journalist is a suitably situated witness. They're observing what they report or claim is happening. Similar sort of thing, witnesses at trial. They testify that this happened, that they were in a suitable situation to observe it happening, so that their claim is supported by their observations. Day-to-day claims. Your partner comes home and tells you what happened in their day. Those claims about what happened in their day are supported by their observations. They're being there to observe what happened. So 3 kinds of empirical claims: scientific, historic, and what I'm calling testimonial claims. They're not the only kinds of empirical claims, but good enough that you get a sense of what is meant by empirical claims. So let's move on to non-empirical claims. Non-empirical claims, again, cannot be fully refuted or fully confirmed with observation, scientific methods, experiment, data collection, experience of any kind. So what do we do with non-empirical claims? Like, how do we decide whether to accept them as true or not to accept them as true? I want to offer a word of caution here. I want to caution you against making an uncritical or unexamined assumption that only empirical claims are able to be confirmed or refuted or debated or investigated in a rigorous and meaningful way. This view, the view that only empirical claims, only what can be measured or observed, can count as knowledge, or that only empirical claims are the subjects of genuine, honest inquiry, is a view called scientism. So I want to caution you not to fall uncritically into the view of scientism. The Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy defines scientism as the belief that the methods of natural science, or the categories and things recognized in natural science, form the only proper elements in any philosophical inquiry. Another definition of scientism is the view that the characteristic methods of natural science are the only source of genuine factual knowledge. So if you agree with scientism, basically you're saying that the only kinds of things that are worth investigating are the things that natural science investigates, and that the only methods that can produce genuine knowledge are scientific methods, which basically puts inquiry into and debate about things like God, souls, afterlife, morality, free will, puts it out of question. We're not going to talk about those things, scientism says, because we can't have knowledge about those things, because only the methods of natural science can give us knowledge. Don't fall into an uncritical acceptance of scientism. Here are some criticisms of this view. Scientism assumes that those things that could be weighed, measured, and counted were more true than those things that could not be quantified. If it couldn't be counted, in other words, it didn't count. So this scientism, this view that only scientific knowledge counts as knowledge, only empirical claims can be known, proven, or proven false, it makes it seem as if only things that are measurable could be counted as knowledge or could be known about. Another critique of scientism, and it's basically just a follow-up of the previous critique, is that it's putting too high value on natural science in comparison with other branches of learning. So the critique goes like this: science is important. What science tells us, the knowledge we get from science, is valuable. But it's not the only way of attaining knowledge. It's not the only way of learning things, of inquiring into things. and the things that other branches of learning can inquire into are also important and valuable to inquire into. So when we go to thinking about non-empirical claims, don't just throw them out the window. Don't just say, well, if we can't observe it, if we can't test it, if we can't measure it, we can't talk about it. So let's think about how we can talk about non-empirical claims. So first, some non-empirical claims are definitions and axioms. And definitions and axioms make very good basic premises in arguments for other non-empirical claims. So if you're going to make an argument about the existence of God, the existence of free will, the existence of an objective moral standard, you probably want to start with a definition of God, objective or free. Once you've started with a definition, you can start to see what sorts of conclusions follow from the definition. What kinds of conclusions can you logically draw based on your definition? Axioms are similar to definitions. Axioms are statements or claims that are so self-evidently true that they are not in need of further support. So in math, in geometry, it's axiomatic that you can draw a straight line between any 2 points. You can draw a straight line between any 2 points as an axiom of math that is so clearly and self-evidently true that it doesn't need further support. In philosophy, and really most human beings accept the principle of non-contradiction as an axiomatic truth. It is true that the same sentence cannot be both true and false at the same time. Axioms, like definitions, can make good basic premises. We start with the definition, we start with the axiom, and then we see what follows logically from that. Analytic claims are another type of non-empirical claim which make good, useful basic premises in arguments for non-empirical conclusions. Analytic claims are, in a sense, true by definition. We derive analytic claims by analyzing the meaning of the relevant terms or concepts. So, for example, the claim all effects have causes is an analytic claim. We derive that claim from the meaning of the word effect. To be an effect is to have a cause, so the claim all effects have causes is an analytic claim. It's true by definition. Another analytic claim that would be true by definition is bachelors are unmarried. If we analyze the concept of bachelor, we see that it follows that bachelors are unmarried. Philosophers get a lot of mileage out of analytic claims, particularly in philosophy of mind. They will analyze certain concepts like the concept of thought, the concept of an idea, the concept of consciousness, to see what follows from our concepts of things. Metaphysical claims are also non-empirical claims. Metaphysical claims are claims about the true nature of reality, claims about the existence of gods, objective moral standards, free will, etc. These are classic examples of metaphysical claims. A few points about metaphysical claims. One, they do not make good basic premises. You do not want to have metaphysical claims as basic premises if you can avoid it. Metaphysical claims are the sorts of claims that you need to support with some further evidence and reasoning. Two, the second thing to notice about metaphysical claims is that some metaphysical claims look a lot like scientific claims. So the claim, for example, that the only thing that exists is matter and energy, that's a metaphysical claim that sounds like a scientific claim. It sounds like a scientific claim because the terms matter and energy are terms that we study in physics. We study matter and energy in physics. But the claim that the only kinds of things that exist are matter and energy is not a scientific claim. It's not a claim that can be verified with observation or experiment or experience, because it's also stating that nothing else exists, nothing like souls or moral standards or gods, and that That claim that nothing else exists is not one that can be either refuted or confirmed by observation. So the claim that all things that exist are made up of matter and energy sounds like a scientific claim, but is really a metaphysical claim. Needs to be supported by further evidence and reasoning. A fourth kind of non-empirical claim are value claims. Value claims can be broken down into two subgroups of claims: aesthetic claims and ethical claims. Aesthetic claims are claims about beauty, ugliness, and other sort of artistic qualities. Ethical claims are claims about morality, claims about right and wrong, just, unjust, good and evil, etc. Value claims can sometimes serve as basic premises, depending on the context of the claim, but probably more frequently they should be supported with some further arguments similar to metaphysical claims. Okay. So, quick review. Non-empirical claims, there's at least four kinds, there may be more. Definitions and axioms and analytic claims are non-empirical claims that are good basic premises. Use these claims as our starting point and see what follows logically from them. Metaphysical claims, claims about the nature of reality, not good basic premises. These need to be supported by an argument. An argument for metaphysical claims, we'll talk more about how to make those in a minute, but certainly they have to have some definitions or analytic claims as basic premises. Value claims, similar to metaphysical claims, usually need to be supported with reasoning and evidence. Okay, so next what I want to talk about is strategies for arguing for metaphysical claims. How do we make an argument for a non-empirical metaphysical claim? Have a basic premise that's a definition, an axiom, or an analytic claim. Start with some definition, axiom, or analytic claim, maybe more than one. Make valid inferences from your definition, axiom, or analytic claim to see what other claims follow. You may include basic premises that are empirical claims that serve as indirect evidence or indirect support for a metaphysical claim. So let me say that again. It's possible to include as basic premises empirical claims that serve as indirect support for a metaphysical claim. Another strategy for making metaphysical claims or arguing for metaphysical conclusions is to apply the principle of logical consistency. So let me explain that a little bit. A set of statements is logically inconsistent if they cannot all be true at the same time. A set of statements is logically inconsistent if they cannot all be true at the same time. The principle of logical consistency tells us if two or more statements are logically inconsistent, at least one of them is false. They could all be false, but at least one of them is false. If a statement is logically inconsistent with other statements we know or have good reason to accept as true, then we should reject the first statement as false. So if we have a statement and it is logically inconsistent with other statements that we have good reasons to believe, then we should reject the original statement. Okay. Now I'm going to give you an example of an argument for a metaphysical claim that uses sort of all of these strategies that I've just described. Basic premise 1. The idea of God is the idea of an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing being. So this basic premise is a definition of God. We start our argument with a definition of God. Basic premise 2. If God is all good, it would not want horrendous suffering to exist. This is an analytic claim. This follows from the definition of all good. So it's basically, this claim is true by just analyzing what all good means. If God is all good, God would not want horrendous suffering to exist. Basic premise 3 is also an analytic claim. If God is all good and all powerful, God would be able to accomplish all its good plans and goals without allowing or causing horrendous suffering. Basic premise 3 is an analytic claim that comes from analyzing the concepts all good and all powerful. Basic premise 4. If God is all-knowing, God would know where horrendous suffering occurs. Again, an analytic claim, analyzing the concept of all-knowing. Here's an intermediate conclusion that follows from our basic premises 1 through 4. If basic premises 1 through 4 are true, then we can have this intermediate conclusion: if God exists, God would prevent horrendous suffering. If God does not want us to suffer, if he can accomplish all of his plans without causing or allowing suffering, and if God knows when and where suffering would occur, then if God exists, God would prevent horrendous suffering from occurring. But horrendous suffering does exist. So basic premise 5 is an empirical claim, more or less an empirical claim, which is arguably true. We can point to cases of horrendous suffering. So this is an empirical claim which offers some indirect support for a metaphysical conclusion. We conclude, therefore, that God does not exist. The principle of inconsistency tells us that the existence of horrendous suffering and God are incompatible. The existence of God, as defined, and horrendous suffering are incompatible. That's what our intermediate conclusion tells us. Since the existence of God is incompatible or inconsistent with the existence of horrendous suffering, and we know that there is horrendous suffering, we conclude that God does not exist. So, let me just recap this argument really quick because it's a strategy for making an argument for a metaphysical claim. Basic premise 1 starts with a definition of God. Basic premises 2, 3, and 4 are analytic claims derived from analyzing the various concepts, all good, all powerful, and all knowing. The intermediate conclusion, if God exists, God would prevent horrendous suffering, follows from the basic premises. Basic premise 5 is an empirical claim which, in the context of this argument, offers some direct support of our conclusion. The intermediate conclusion states that the existence of horrendous suffering is incompatible with the existence of God. Basic premise 5 tells us that horrendous suffering does exist, so the principle of consistency allows us to conclude that God does not exist. Okay, that's it. There's a lot there. Make sure that you understand the difference between empirical and non-empirical claims, between validity and truth,